What's up, vetters? Patrick here with Vetted. I have an amazing video for y'all today. Chris Ramsey from Area 52 interviewed Nick Pope, and it was an amazing interview, and I have some highlights to share with you. So before we dive into that, let me ask you, please hit that like button, vetters. That really helps out the videos. And of course, if you haven't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. I put out daily videos about the UFO topic. Now let's jump in to this new interview with Nick Pope, because some of the things he says are quite startling. Now, here is a short sort of compilation that Chris Ramsey put at the beginning of the interview to kind of give you an idea of what's to come in it. And then afterwards, I'm going to play a couple clips that I found very interesting from the actual interview themselves, and we'll discuss it. So here's a little highlight reel of what to expect from this new Nick Pope interview with Chris Ramsey from Area 52.
What is one sort of fringe encounter that still kind of troubles you to this day?
We had a case in 1993, well, actually a wave of sightings, collectively known as the Cosford incident. One guy was so stunned by this huge triangular-shaped craft that he leapt into his car and started trying to chase it, with his family in the back screaming at him to stop. In this same encounter, there was a farmer who saw this craft very low, and he thought it's so low, he thought maybe it landed, and he went up to the field, and all the cows in the field were standing in a circle, like facing each other. Straight out of the X-Files.
Whoa.
A whole bunch of normal-looking people all walked into an art shop in central London, were there for like a long time, and she just felt there was something weird about these people. And then after a long time, they made a big show of coming up and buying a single pencil, like it was like a big thing. And then they handed over a very high denomination banknote, and when the woman went to give them their change, they looked confused, like they didn't understand the concept of getting their change bag. And she was so struck by this that she phoned somebody afterwards and said, there are aliens in my shop.
So you said you got to know this woman quite well. Was that afterwards? Did she have any other encounters?
One that I would say was more of a time slip.
Missing time?
Seeing somebody that looked like herself from the future.
Now, let me say that when I first started Vetted, I actually interviewed Nick Pope. He was one of the first people I ever interviewed on this channel. In fact, that was going to be the main point of Vetted, was me just doing interviews. I clearly transitioned into doing this daily video thing, but initially it was all going to be interviews. I interviewed Avi Loeb, Nick Pope, and Mick West, right? That was all back in the beginning. So I'm going to put a link down below to this interview that I did with Nick Pope, because I think it's quite interesting, because it's from a couple of years ago, and I can see that Nick Pope has sort of changed his tune a little bit about things. And that's interesting to me, because what has changed over the last 2 years? I should interview Nick Pope again to ask him some of those questions, right? So again, link in the description to the Vetted interview with Nick Pope, so you can check that out and see sort of the difference between the Nick Pope of 2025 and the Nick Pope of 2023, because when I interviewed Nick Pope, this was before David Grush came out, and I really feel that, like, after David Grush came out and they had that initial huge hearing, right, in July of 2023, that just changed the game, and this was literally a couple months before that. So very interesting. But this interview with Nick Pope on Chris Ramsey's channel is fascinating. I highly recommend checking it out, because Chris is definitely one of the top tier interviewers in the UFO community, and he has a sick setup, right, of course, and he just does such a great job of asking the right questions and then presenting it in a way that's not only entertaining but informative, right? And one part in particular that I enjoyed about this interview was, you know, from that highlight reel, is this story about this sort of art shop, because I found that to be quite fascinating. And here's a little bit longer clip of that particular incident.
To answer your question about that left an impression on me, it wasn't really an abduction, but it was an encounter with, I guess, beings. A particular woman who I got to know quite well uh, had this experience that a whole bunch of apparently, normal looking people all walked into an art shop in central London, started looking at all the produce, were there for like a long time, and she just felt there was something weird about these people. And then after a long time, they made a big show of coming up and buying a single pencil, like it was like a big thing. And then they handed over a very high denomination banknote. And when the woman went to give them their change, they they looked confused, like they didn't understand the concept of getting their change bag. And she was so struck by this that she phoned somebody afterwards, and in fact during this whole thing, and said, there are aliens in my shop.
I think Chris Ramsey's reaction says it all, right? Just jaw dropped open. I mean, that is a fascinating story. But I do have one question. Why would that woman just immediately think aliens? Why wouldn't they think foreigner from somewhere else? Maybe they didn't understand how much change they were getting back, right? I'm just saying, I don't know. Why jump to alien beings in your art shop because they bought one pencil? And it's just a lot there unknown, right? I don't know. This seems a little unusual. I guess I would just need more details, right, about this. So it is fascinating, but again, why jump to the conclusion of aliens, right, there? So I don't know, right? Definitely a fascinating story. And look, it doesn't stop there with this person that Nick Pope knows, because again, this is the first time I've heard these stories, right? Which is why I found it interesting. And if I'm being honest, there's a lot of things in this interview from Chris Ramsey with Nick Pope that I never heard from Nick Pope before, and I find it quite interesting. But there's one other part from this particular friend of Nick Pope that I found also to be interesting.
So you said you got to know this woman quite well. Was that afterwards? Did she have any other encounters?
One that I would say was more of a time slip kind of phenomenon.
She missing time?
Seeing somebody that looked like herself from the future.
Whoa.
And it's again, I often find that the high strangeness of these cases is underreported.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it, I use the word surreal quite deliberately. The true phenomenon, I think, is much more surreal.
Now, that is some Back to the Future stuff right there, right? Imagine seeing yourself from the future. Would you recognize yourself? That's also an interesting question. I have a feeling I would recognize myself, but maybe not. If I went back to my 18-year-old self, would I recognize myself? I don't know. And what does that say about being able to interact with yourself from the future, right? Don't they say that that can't happen? But, the grandfather paradox. But who knows, right? I'm just speculating here. But all right, that's an interesting story. I would also like to hear more details about, which they don't get into in this interview, of why she thought it was her from the future, right? What about it? Was just her look? Was something? What about it, right? And I agree with Nick that a lot of this high strangeness sometimes doesn't get reported, right? And Nick Pope actually expands upon that a little bit, and I found that to be also very fascinating, that UFO researchers or ufologists or even people like myself who cover this topic maybe don't expand upon some of the details because, well, really a myriad of reasons. But let's let Nick Pope explain a little bit more about that.
And that's the kind of surreal nature of these encounters that sometimes doesn't even come out in the literature, because I think sometimes ufologists self-censor because they say, look, everyone knows what an alien looks like. Everyone knows what an abduction is. It's a very structured thing, the beam, the table, the medical exam. When you get something like this that doesn't fit the model, ufologists self-censor and throw it out. But me being a kind of, I don't know, a sort of even-handed, like, disinterested kind of observer of this, I take all the cases that I can get. And so that was one that really struck me.
I mean, at the end of the day, I want all the data and I'll decide what to do with it. That's why I don't mind covering stories. I don't necessarily need to believe it or not believe it to hear it, right? Why do I need to make that decision about every single thing? I believe it or I don't believe it, right? Why can't I just take it in and keep it on the back burner? Nothing wrong with that. So again, I'll put a link in the description to the full interview with Nick Pope on Chris Ramsey's channel, Area 52. And if you're not subscribed to that channel, y'all, or if you've never heard of it, I don't know what you're doing. It is definitely one of the top channels covering the UFO topic, and I highly recommend it. So without further ado, that's it for this video. Thank y'all so much for watching, Vetters. We'll see you on the next one. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace.